As Gabrielle Lawson settled into her plush first-class seat, she let out a slow, deep breath, savoring a rare moment of stillness. The soft hum of the airplane engines, the crisp scent of leather seats, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling in the air created a comforting cocoon around her. She was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally. The past week had been a whirlwind of high-stakes meetings, late-night negotiations, and the ceaseless pressure that came with running a multi-million-dollar tech company. But this trip was different. This flight marked a turning point in her career, a defining moment that had been years in the making. She adjusted the silk scarf draped around her neck, smoothing out the fabric with steady fingers. It was a small indulgence, a gift she had given herself after closing the biggest deal of her career. Gabrielle had learned, after years of relentless struggle, to celebrate her victories, no matter how fleeting. Her journey had not been an easy one, nor had it been paved with privilege or ease. Raised in a modest neighborhood by parents who had worked tirelessly to provide for her, she had learned early on that success was not simply handed out, it had to be earned. She had faced barriers that others didn't even recognize existed. Every boardroom she walked into, she was often the only woman, the only black person, the only one who had to prove, again and again, that she deserved to be there. She had grown used to the skeptical glances, the subtle dismissals, the quiet but ever-present question hanging in the air: does she really belong? And every single time, she had answered that question with her achievements, with results so undeniable that even the most reluctant skeptics had no choice but to acknowledge her presence. And now, she was here, seat 1A, first class, a space she had rightfully claimed with her own hard-earned money. Yet, even as she settled in, a flicker of unease lingered at the back of her mind. She knew how these spaces worked, how unwritten rules often held more weight than policies printed on a ticket. She had earned this seat, but would the world see it that way? She pushed the thought aside, refusing to let it steal this moment of peace. Outside her window, the evening sky stretched wide, painted in hues of deep orange and violet. It reminded her of home, of childhood nights spent sitting on the porch with her mother, dreaming of a future that felt so far away back then. She could almost hear her mother's voice now, steady and resolute. Keep your head high, Gabrielle. They'll always try to question you, but you don't have to answer to anyone. Just show them. She smiled at the memory, allowing it to steady her heartbeat. A flight attendant passed by, offering her a polite smile as he placed a glass of sparkling water on the tray table in front of her. She nodded in quiet thanks, her fingers wrapping around the cool glass. For once, she allowed herself to simply exist in the space she had fought so hard to claim. But the world, as always, had other plans. The moment the blonde woman entered the cabin, Gabrielle felt it before she even heard the words. That sharp, assessing gaze sweeping over the rows, scanning for something, someone, who didn't fit the expected mold. The flicker of irritation that passed over the woman's face when her eyes landed on Gabrielle. The way she hesitated, as if confirming to herself that something was off. Gabrielle didn't need to hear the words to know what was coming next. She had seen this play out before. In hotel lobbies, in high-end restaurants, in corporate offices where she was mistaken for an assistant instead of the CEO. Sure enough, the woman, Evelyn Stokes, she would soon learn, strode toward her with an air of entitlement that was both familiar and exhausting. And when Evelyn spoke, her voice was laced with the same quiet condescension Gabrielle had encountered all her life. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, tilting her head with a practiced smile. "I think there's been a mistake." Gabrielle exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around the armrest. "Here we go again." "I don't believe so," she said, her voice calm but firm. Evelyn's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "It's just that I always sit in 1A," she said, her tone taking on an edge of frustration. "I'm a Platinum Elite member, you see, and I'm sure they wouldn't have given my seat away." Gabrielle could have laughed if it weren't so insulting. Instead, she simply met Evelyn's gaze, steady and unyielding. "This is my seat," she said, her voice smooth as glass. "I reserved it weeks ago." Evelyn blinked, her eyes flicking to the flight attendant who had been hovering nearby. Gabrielle could already see it happening, the hesitation, the unspoken question in the attendant's eyes, the momentary weighing of her against Evelyn. For a split second, Gabrielle felt the old frustration rising within her. The exhaustion of constantly having to prove herself, to justify her place in spaces she had earned. But then she remembered her mother's voice. Steady and resolute. You don't have to answer to anyone. Just show them. So she didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply reached for her boarding pass, held it up, and let the facts speak for themselves. And just like that, the weight of Evelyn's entitlement began to crumble. Evelyn Stokes walked into the first-class cabin with the air of someone who had never once been told, no. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the floor, her freshly manicured fingers gripping the strap of an expensive leather handbag as she swept her gaze across the seating arrangements. From the moment she stepped inside, her presence demanded attention, not because of any inherent authority, but because she carried herself with an entitlement so thick it practically solidified the space around her. People like Evelyn weren't accustomed to being questioned, much less denied what they believed to be rightfully theirs. Her seat, was supposed to be waiting for her in 1A. Just as it always was. It was a position of prestige. The first to be served. The best view of the cabin. The effortless confirmation of her status as a Platinum Elite member. She had flown with this airline more times than she could count. And in all her years of first-class travel, she had never been asked to settle for anything less than perfection. But as she approached the row, she stopped short. Someone was sitting in her seat. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she took in the woman before her. Gabrielle Lawson sat poised, elegant but unimpressed, as if she had every right to be there, which, in Evelyn's mind, was the first mistake. She immediately assessed Gabrielle, her quick, practiced judgment fueled by years of moving through the world as someone who belonged. Someone who had never had to fight for a place in spaces like these. But this woman didn't fit. Evelyn felt it in her bones. That instinctive, unshakable belief that something was wrong. Her polished, saccharine smile barely masked the disdain curling at the edges of her lips. "Excuse me," she said, her voice perfectly polite, yet laced with an unmistakable sharpness. "I believe there's been a mistake." Gabrielle looked up, her gaze meeting Evelyn's with an unwavering calm. "I don't believe so." Evelyn's fingers tapped against her handbag. A subtle but telling sign of irritation. This was supposed to be simple, a quiet misunderstanding. A minor inconvenience that would be swiftly corrected once the flight crew recognized their error. Platinum Elite members like her were always accommodated. The alternative, that she was actually being asked to sit somewhere else, was unthinkable. "You see," Evelyn continued, her voice still honeyed but now carrying a thread of condescension, "I always sit in 1A. I've been flying with this airline for years. And I'm a priority member. They must have reassigned it by mistake." Gabrielle merely tilted her head. "Unbothered. I booked this seat weeks ago." The polite veneer on Evelyn's face began to crack. She had expected an apology. A hurried attempt to fix the situation. Not this defiance. She turned sharply toward the nearest flight attendant, her voice suddenly dripping with manufactured distress. "Excuse me, yes. Hi. I need you to check this seating arrangement. I was assigned 1A. And there seems to be a mix-up." The flight attendant, a young man with a neatly pressed uniform, hesitated as he glanced between the two women. Gabrielle was already holding up her ticket, offering it with a quiet assurance that needed no embellishment. "I have my boarding pass," she said smoothly. The attendant's eyes flickered over the confirmation, and Evelyn watched with growing frustration as he nodded in acknowledgement. "Miss Lawson is correctly assigned to this seat." Evelyn's smile froze, her grip on her handbag tightening. "That can't be right," she said, her voice now carrying a forced, brittle edge. "She must have booked a last-minute upgrade. People do that all the time." Gabrielle exhaled softly, something flickering in her gaze, not anger, not surprise, just recognition. This wasn't the first time she had encountered this kind of subtle dismissal. This underlying belief that she must have somehow taken something she didn't deserve. "I suggest you take your assigned seat," Gabrielle said, her voice unwavering. "This conversation is over." Evelyn's breath hitched in indignation. "Over? Oh, no. This conversation was far from over." She turned back to the flight attendant, this time letting her irritation bleed into her words. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice lowering. "Dangerous now. I am a Platinum Elite member. I always fly first class. I am not about to let someone." Her companion, Linda, shifted uncomfortably beside her, as if sensing they were treading dangerous ground. "Evelyn," she whispered, trying to reel her back in. But Evelyn was too far gone. Her sense of entitlement was a tidal wave, crashing forward, demanding to be acknowledged. The attendant, sensing the tension thickening in the air, hesitated before clearing his throat. "If you have any further concerns, ma'am, you're welcome to speak with our supervisor." Evelyn's mouth pressed into a thin line, her fury simmering just beneath the surface. She had connections, she had status, and yet, for the first time in a long time, none of it seemed to matter. The weight of her privilege, her years of being given what she wanted without question, was suddenly meaningless in the face of a single, undeniable truth: she was wrong. And she knew it. The flight attendant turned to leave. The conversation officially concluded, but Evelyn wasn't ready to let go. She wasn't ready to sit down in a seat that wasn't hers. To accept the quiet but humiliating lesson that this woman, Gabrielle Lawson, had just delivered without ever needing to raise her voice. She swallowed hard, but the bitterness of it burned. Gabrielle, meanwhile, had already turned back to her notebook. Unfazed, unbothered. She didn't gloat, she didn't need to, because she knew, as Evelyn now did, that true power didn't come from demanding respect, it came from already having it. And Evelyn? Evelyn had just lost hers. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to choke on. Gabrielle Lawson sat still in her assigned seat, her fingers resting lightly against the armrest, her heartbeat steady but alert. She had been here before, not in this exact situation, not in this exact seat, but in this moment, facing the same unspoken battle she had fought all her life. It wasn't about the seat. It wasn't even about the airline. It was about the quiet, insidious nature of bias, the kind that lingered in the way people hesitated, in the way their eyes flickered with doubt before words even left their lips. Evelyn Stokes had made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go. And now, the flight crew was faced with a choice they didn't realize they were making. Would they stand by Gabrielle, a black woman who had followed all the rules, who had booked her first-class seat fair and square, or would they lean toward Evelyn, a wealthy, entitled woman whose confidence alone seemed to carry more weight than any piece of paper Gabrielle could present? The flight attendant, Greg, was the first to step forward. He was young, maybe in his late 20s, with the kind of polished demeanor that suggested he had been trained to smile through anything. His uniform was crisp, his ID badge gleaming under the cabin lights, but the slight twitch in his fingers as he reached for his tablet gave him away. He was uncomfortable. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," he said, his voice polite but faintly uncertain. "There is no misunderstanding," Gabrielle responded, her tone measured. "This is my seat. My ticket confirms that." Greg hesitated, his eyes darting between Gabrielle and Evelyn, as though waiting for some unseen force to guide his next move. "Miss," he glanced at her boarding pass, though he had already heard her name. "Miss Lawson, would you mind if I just checked your ticket one more time? Just to be absolutely sure?" Gabrielle's lips pressed together in a thin line. She knew what this was. It was doubt, not because there was any real uncertainty, not because the airline had made an error, but because somewhere in the back of Greg's mind, he had already determined that Evelyn's complaint must have some legitimacy. He was looking for a way to resolve this as quickly as possible, and deep down, Gabrielle knew that his quickest resolution would mean her inconvenience. Still, she wasn't here to make a scene. She handed him her ticket, watching as he scanned it, his brows furrowing when it confirmed what she had already stated. "Well, it does say seat 1A, he admitted, but he turned to Evelyn, his posture deferential, as if offering her an opportunity to override the truth with sheer willpower. "Mrs. Stokes, are you certain this is the seat you were assigned?" Evelyn scoffed, folding her arms. "Of course I am. I've been flying first class with this airline for years. I always get 1A. I don't know what kind of mix-up happened, but I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of inconvenience." Greg nodded, absorbing her words as though they carried more weight than Gabrielle's boarding pass. Then he turned back to Gabrielle. "Miss Lawson, would you mind moving to another seat? Just so we can resolve this quickly?" There it was. Gabrielle had expected it, but it still made her stomach tighten. The subtle way he framed it. The quiet expectation that she would be the one to step aside. Not because she was wrong. Not because she had done anything out of line. But because it would be easier if she just gave in. She kept her voice calm. even as her frustration simmered beneath the surface. I do mind. Actually, I paid for this seat. And I will be keeping it. Greg blinked, taken aback by her unwavering response. Evelyn, however, took it as an opportunity to press further. Oh, come on, she huffed, flipping her platinum blonde hair over her shoulder in exasperation. You can sit in 2C, it's still first class. It's not like you're being kicked off the plane. I don't see why this is such a big deal. Gabrielle's patience thinned. It's a big deal because it's my seat, she said evenly. I don't owe you an explanation beyond that. Evelyn's lips curled in frustration. But before she could fire back, another uniformed figure appeared, the flight supervisor. Deborah Lane. She was older than Greg, with graying hair neatly pulled back into a bun, and the presence of someone who had spent years in customer service. But despite her experience, Gabrielle could already see where this was going. Deborah's eyes flickered toward Evelyn first, taking in her frustration, her wealth, her status. When she turned to Gabrielle, there was a measured neutrality to her gaze. But Gabrielle had seen that look before. It was the look of someone calculating the most convenient solution, not the fairest one. Miss Lawson, Deborah began, her tone polite but firm. I understand your concern, but we want to ensure all our passengers are comfortable. Would you be open to moving to another first-class seat? We'd be happy to accommodate you. There was that word again, accommodate. As if she was the problem. As if she needed to be adjusted to make things easier for everyone else. Gabrielle took a slow breath. She had spent her entire life navigating situations like this, where compliance was expected. Where pushing back would be seen as making a fuss. Where the burden was always placed on her to be the bigger person. She met Deborah's gaze head-on. Would you be asking me to move if I looked different? A sharp silence fell over the cabin. Deborah's posture stiffened, and Greg shifted uncomfortably beside her. Evelyn let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. Oh, please, don't make this about that. Gabrielle didn't take her eyes off Deborah. I'm asking a simple question. Would you be treating me the same way if I looked like her? She nodded toward Evelyn. Would you be asking her to move? Deborah opened her mouth, then closed it. Greg's eyes dropped to the floor. That was all the answer Gabrielle needed. She sat back in her seat, her spine straight, her expression cool but unyielding. I'm not moving, and if you insist on pressing this issue, I will escalate it myself. Evelyn sputtered in indignation. You can't seriously. Deborah cut her off, her voice unusually tight. Mrs. Stokes, I'm afraid Miss Lawson is correct. This seat is hers. Evelyn's face twisted in rage. But Gabrielle didn't flinch. Greg and Deborah lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for her to change her mind, to comply like they expected her to. But when she made no move to budge, they had no choice but to accept the reality. Gabrielle Lawson wasn't going anywhere. And for once, the system would have to adjust for her. Gabrielle Lawson sat still, her fingers resting lightly against the armrest, her breath steady despite the storm raging around her. She had fought too many battles in her life to let this one break her. This wasn't about a seat, it was about dignity. It was about the unspoken rules that people like Evelyn Stokes were used to bending in their favor. Rules that Gabrielle was expected to abide by without question. But not today. The tension in the first-class cabin was suffocating. Evelyn's frustration had reached a boiling point, her sharp voice slicing through the murmurs of the other passengers. The flight attendants hovered, hesitant and nervous, caught between corporate policies and their instinct to appease a high-status, high-paying customer. But Gabrielle? She was calm, still, a mountain unmoved by the raging winds. Miss Lawson, Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor, said again, her voice careful, as though speaking to someone fragile. We're simply trying to make this easier for everyone. Wouldn't it be more comfortable for you to switch to another seat? It's still first class. There it was, comfortable, a word that had never truly belonged to her. It was never about her comfort, it was about Evelyn's. About maintaining the illusion that power and privilege were the only currencies that mattered in spaces like these. Gabrielle inhaled deeply, tilting her head slightly as she met Deborah's expectant gaze. There was a weight in her stare. Something cool and unwavering. Something that made even the most confident people hesitate. No, she said simply. A single word. A refusal wrapped in steel. Deborah blinked, momentarily thrown off. I'm sorry? I said no, Gabrielle repeated, her voice smooth, unshaken. I paid for this seat. I booked it weeks ago. I'm not moving just because someone wants me to. Her words settled over the space like thunder, reverberating through the silence. Evelyn scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Oh, this is ridiculous, she spat. You're really going to make a scene over this? I was trying to be nice about it. Gabrielle's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. A scene. That's what they always called it when people like her refused to fold. When she didn't shrink. When she didn't apologize for existing in a space someone else had silently decided wasn't hers. I don't need your kindness, Gabrielle said, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable power. I need the respect I already paid for. The other passengers were watching now, pretending to be lost in their books or their screens. But Gabrielle could feel their eyes. Some of them, she knew, were waiting for her to give in. Others were hoping she wouldn't. Deborah's shoulders stiffened. She was a veteran in customer service. She had diffused fights, handled belligerent passengers, and smoothed over PR nightmares. But this wasn't something that could be de-escalated by simply asking the most reasonable person in the room to give in. Still, she tried. Miss Lawson, please understand, Deborah said, her tone tight. Mrs. Stokes is a Platinum Elite member. Gabrielle cut her off. And that changes what, exactly? Does her status outweigh my rights? The sharp silence that followed made Deborah falter. Evelyn scoffed again, tossing her hair over her shoulder. Oh, please, don't act like this is some civil rights issue. Gabrielle turned to her then, her eyes burning with something unreadable. Something vast and ancient and tired. I don't have to act like anything, Gabrielle said softly. You're proving my point just fine on your own. Evelyn's mouth opened and then closed. Deborah exhaled sharply, frustration flickering across her face. Gabrielle recognized that look, too. The why can't you just comply look. The look that meant Deborah knew Gabrielle was right. But right wasn't the most convenient answer. It didn't matter. Gabrielle had spent her whole life navigating spaces where she wasn't meant to be. She had spent years proving that she belonged, forcing doors open when others wanted them shut, standing firm when the world expected her to kneel. And in this moment, in this overpriced first-class seat, she was doing it again. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't pleading, she wasn't causing a scene. She was simply existing, and that was enough to make some people uncomfortable. Greg, the younger flight attendant, cleared his throat, his discomfort evident. I think we should. Deborah held up a hand, silencing him. She wasn't done calculating yet. Miss Lawson, she tried one final time, her voice softer now, like a coaxing mother speaking to a child who refused to move. Would you reconsider? For the sake of. Gabrielle leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with her. If I was in Evelyn's seat, and she was in mine, she asked, her voice like steel wrapped in silk, would you be asking her to move? Silence. Deborah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Greg looked down at the floor. And Evelyn knew she had lost. Gabrielle sat back, exhaling softly as she picked up her notebook and pen, flipping to a blank page as though this conversation had never happened. A move of quiet dismissal. You are no longer worth my time. And just like that, the power shifted. Deborah straightened, clearing her throat. Miss Lawson, she said at last, her voice carefully neutral. Enjoy your flight. Evelyn let out a strangled noise of disbelief. Her face twisted in outrage. Are you kidding me? But Gabrielle was already writing in her notebook, unmoved, because today, she had won, and she hadn't even needed to raise her voice to do it. If you believe in standing up against injustice, if you believe in strength without compromise, hit that like button. Let's show the world that quiet resistance is still resistance, and that dignity is not up for negotiation. Gabrielle Lawson sat still in her first-class seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. The confrontation had ended, but the storm it had left behind still lingered. The tension in the cabin was thick, heavy with unspoken words and silent judgment. Evelyn Stokes sat fuming 2 rows back, her arms crossed tightly, her face burning with indignation. The flight attendants had retreated to the galley, whispering among themselves, their nervous glances darting toward Gabrielle like she was an unsolvable problem. But Gabrielle had learned long ago that silence was a weapon. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The quiet expectation that she would just move on, let it go. That was what people like Evelyn counted on, that once the fight was over, they would still win because their entitlement would linger. unchecked and unpunished. Not this time. Gabrielle reached into her leather bag, pulling out her phone with a slow, deliberate motion. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Marcus Caldwell, senior executive at the airline's corporate headquarters. She pressed the call button. The faint hum of the engines filled the space as the line rang once, twice. Then a voice, smooth and professional, answered. Gabrielle, I wasn't expecting a call from you today. Marcus knew her, he respected her, and most importantly, he understood exactly who she was. The kind of woman who didn't waste time with trivial complaints. Gabrielle inhaled, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. I need you to handle something for me. A pause. Then, what happened? She gave him the short version, how she had been asked. Not once, but 3 times to give up her seat for someone whose only argument was I always get what I want. How the flight crew had hesitated. How they had expected her to yield. How, even after she had refused, there was still a lingering expectation that she should be grateful for merely being allowed to keep what was already hers. Marcus listened without interrupting, but Gabrielle could hear the change in his breathing, the sharp inhale when she mentioned Evelyn's platinum elite status. The slow exhale when she recounted how the flight attendants had spoken to her. The way their words had been wrapped in false politeness but heavy with bias. This is unacceptable, Marcus said, his voice tight with restrained anger. You have the names of the staff involved? Greg, the flight attendant, Deborah Lane, the supervisor, and of course, Mrs. Evelyn Stokes, Gabrielle replied, her voice even, steady. I want a formal review of the situation. And I want to know how many times this has happened before. Another pause. Then, consider it done. Gabrielle leaned back slightly, her grip on her phone relaxing. Also, she added, almost as an afterthought, I assume you're aware that I'm on my way to finalize a partnership with your airline's European division. Marcus hesitated. I am. Gabrielle's voice softened, but the steel in it remained. If this is how your airline treats its passengers, I may need to reconsider our arrangement. Another sharp inhale. You won't have to, Marcus said quickly. Give me 20 minutes. Gabrielle ended the call, slipping the phone back into her bag. She didn't need to say another word. The gears were already in motion. The shift. The first sign that things were changing came just 15 minutes later. The overhead announcement chimed, and a flight attendant's voice, one Gabrielle didn't recognize, came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the unexpected delay. We appreciate your patience as we finalize some internal matters. We will be underway shortly. Greg and Deborah exchanged a look, the color draining from their faces. Evelyn sat up straighter, her fingers curling around the armrests. Then the second sign came. The cabin door opened, and 2 sharply dressed men stepped inside. Corporate representatives, the kind who didn't show up unless something big had happened. The kind who could decide, with a single conversation, who would keep their jobs and who would be looking for a new one. They made their way toward the front of the cabin, where Deborah and Greg stood frozen. The taller of the 2 men stopped in front of the flight crew, pulling out a sleek tablet. Miss Lane, he said to Deborah, his voice coldly professional. A word. Deborah swallowed, then nodded, following them into the galley. Greg hesitated before being motioned to join them. The door closed behind them. The first-class cabin was deathly silent. The other passengers, who had been pretending to ignore the earlier confrontation, now openly watched. Even Evelyn seemed uneasy, shifting in her seat as though she was no longer certain of the power she had once wielded so effortlessly. Gabrielle remained still, her expression unreadable. Then, the door reopened. Deborah and Greg stepped out, their faces pale, their movements stiff. The corporate representative's voice rang out, clear and final, effective immediately. Both of you are relieved from duty. A sharp gasp rippled through the cabin. Greg let out a choked sound, disbelief written all over his face. Deborah merely closed her eyes, exhaling in quiet defeat. Then the final blow came. The representative turned toward Evelyn, his expression neutral, unreadable. Mrs. Stokes, we've reviewed the situation. Your behavior today has violated our airline's code of conduct. Effective immediately. Your platinum elite status is revoked. Evelyn gasped, her face contorting in shock. What? You can't be serious. Do you have any idea how much money I've spent with this airline? The man didn't even blink. Yes, Ma'am, and after today, you won't be spending any more. The weight of those words crashed over Evelyn like a tidal wave. Her chest heaved, her hands shaking as she realized she had lost. Gabrielle didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply picked up her notebook and flipped to the next page. Because the fight was over. And she had already won. If you believe in standing up for what's right, comment below and show your support for Gabrielle. Have you ever experienced injustice like this? Let's talk about it. Your voice matters. Let's make sure no one ever doubts where they belong. The air in the first-class cabin was thick with tension, every breath carrying the weight of what had just unfolded. Gabrielle Lawson remained seated in 1A, her expression unreadable, though she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Some held silent admiration, others a careful curiosity. But one thing was certain, no one would forget this moment. Across the aisle, Evelyn Stokes sat rigidly in her seat, her jaw clenched so tightly that it looked as if she might crack a tooth. Her entire body screamed resistance, defiance, a desperate attempt to hold on to the privilege that had always shielded her from consequences. She had spent years moving through life with the unwavering certainty that no matter what happened, no matter how she acted, she would always be accommodated. Not today. The cabin door swung open, and two corporate representatives stepped inside, their dark suits crisp and their presence commanding. They weren't here to pass out snacks or smooth over complaints. They were here to restore balance, to rectify the mistake their employees had made when they chose to prioritize status over fairness. Gabrielle didn't move, but she could feel the shift in power. This was no longer just about her seat, it was about justice. The taller of the two men, a broad-shouldered executive with sharp eyes, scanned the room before his gaze landed on Deborah Lane, the flight supervisor. His voice was even, professional, but carried an edge of finality. "Miss Lane, step forward." Deborah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the hem of her uniform as she hesitated. She knew what was coming. The second representative, a woman with an air of quiet authority, glanced at Greg, the flight attendant who had fumbled through his role in the situation, his hands now shaking at his sides. "You as well," she said. Greg's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed nervously. But he obeyed, his feet dragging as he stepped toward the corporate officials. The rest of the flight crew remained frozen in place, knowing better than to interfere. The first representative folded his arms. "We've reviewed the situation based on passenger accounts, recorded interactions, and the direct report from corporate headquarters." A heavy pause. "Effective immediately. Both of you are relieved of duty." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Even those who had remained silent during the earlier confrontation now leaned forward, their expressions a mix of shock and understanding. Greg let out a strangled sound, his face paling. "Wait, please. I didn't mean." Deborah inhaled sharply, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second before opening them again. Unlike Greg, she didn't argue. She simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. Somewhere deep inside, she had known this was coming. "Your behavior was not only unprofessional but also discriminatory." The woman continued. "As representatives of this airline, you are expected to uphold our values of fairness and respect, regardless of a passenger's background or perceived status." Evelyn scoffed from her seat, crossing her arms as she glared at the two corporate officials. "Oh, please, you're making a big deal out of nothing. These people," she waved vaguely toward Gabrielle without even looking at her, "are so sensitive these days. What happened to good customer service?" The woman's gaze snapped to Evelyn with a precision so sharp that it felt like a slap. "Mrs. Stokes," she said, her voice now clipped with cold authority, "you are the next matter we need to address." Evelyn blinked, momentarily thrown off by the sudden shift of attention. "Me? I'm the customer here. I was the one wronged." The first corporate official sighed, as if already exhausted by what he knew would come next. "Mrs. Stokes, you repeatedly violated our airline's code of conduct by harassing another passenger, attempting to override seat assignments, and creating a disruption that delayed this flight." Evelyn sat up straighter, her nose flaring in disbelief. "I am a Platinum Elite member," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Do you have any idea how much money I've spent flying with this airline? How dare you treat me this way?" The woman didn't flinch. "Your status has been noted," she said coolly, "and effective immediately. It is revoked." Silence. Pure, unbroken silence. Evelyn's mouth fell open, But no sound came out. It was as if the words had physically struck her, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her fingers gripped the armrests so tightly that her knuckles turned white. You can't do that," she stammered. "I'll call my lawyer. I'll take this to corporate myself." The man raised an eyebrow. "You're welcome to try, but corporate has already made its decision." The words "corporate has already made its decision" hit Evelyn harder than anything else. She had wielded her privilege like a weapon for so long, so effortlessly, that the idea of it being stripped away seemed impossible. She turned, her gaze locking onto Gabrielle with pure venom. "This is your fault." Gabrielle finally looked up. Her expression was calm, poised, unshaken. "No," she said softly. "This is yours." Evelyn's face burned red, her breathing ragged. She wanted to fight, to scream, to demand someone, anyone, fix this. But there was no one left to listen. The second corporate official gestured toward the aisle. "Mrs. Stokes, you will be escorted off this flight. Security is waiting for you at the gate." It was over. Evelyn opened her mouth to argue. But nothing she said would change what was already set in motion. Her reign of untouchable privilege had ended in the span of a single flight. Slowly, she rose from her seat, the tension in her shoulders unmistakable. The other passengers averted their eyes, unwilling to meet her gaze as she was led down the aisle. Gabrielle watched her go, not with triumph, but with something deeper, relief. This time, the system had worked. This time, justice had prevailed. She exhaled slowly, turning back to her notebook. The hum of the engines filled the space around her, steady and unfazed, as though the sky itself had been waiting for this moment to be set right. The tension in the first-class cabin had finally begun to dissipate, but the weight of what had just occurred still hung in the air like an unshaken storm. Gabrielle Lawson sat quietly in her seat, hands resting lightly on her lap, her expression composed but unyielding. She had faced countless moments in her life where she had been expected to shrink, to make herself smaller, to step aside, to accept that the world often bent for others but never for her. But today, she had refused. She had done more than hold onto her seat. She had held onto her dignity, her right to exist in a space she had rightfully claimed. And for once, the system had listened. Across the aisle, the seat Evelyn Stokes had once occupied sat empty. A silent testament to the downfall of unchecked entitlement. Evelyn had been removed from the flight, escorted out under the watchful eyes of a cabin full of passengers who had all, in some way, been witnesses to a turning tide. The quiet murmurs that had once been whispers of uncertainty had now turned into something else, understanding. A flight attendant, one Gabrielle hadn't seen before, approached her carefully. There was a nervous energy in his movements, as if he were walking on the fragile remains of something broken. He wasn't Greg. He wasn't one of the ones who had doubted her, who had silently asked her to be the one to fold. "Miss Lawson," he began, his voice soft but clear. "We just received a message from corporate. They would like to offer you their sincerest apologies." Gabrielle met his gaze evenly. "Waiting. They've acknowledged the way this situation was handled was unacceptable." He continued, "And they'd like to extend an offer of complimentary first-class travel for the next 2 years as a gesture of goodwill." A few of the surrounding passengers turned slightly, listening in. Gabrielle exhaled slowly, letting the words settle in the space between them. 2 years of free first-class flights. It was a significant offer. The kind of compensation that some people would take without hesitation. A sign that the airline knew they had messed up. But Gabrielle wasn't here for personal rewards. She had fought for something bigger than herself today. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice smooth and unwavering. "I appreciate the offer," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But this isn't just about me." The flight attendant blinked, uncertain. "I want to know what changes the airline will be making to ensure this doesn't happen again." Gabrielle continued, "I don't need free flights. I need accountability." Her words carried through the cabin. And this time, she knew the right people were listening. The flight attendant straightened, nodding quickly. "Of course, Miss Lawson. Corporate has also informed us that they will be conducting a full review of staff training procedures. They're implementing mandatory bias training for all employees, starting immediately." Gabrielle studied him for a long moment. "And what about reporting protocols? What happens the next time a passenger experiences discrimination?" The attendant hesitated for a brief second before responding. They're working on establishing a new department specifically for handling these cases. He said, an internal team dedicated to ensuring that bias, discrimination, or any form of unfair treatment is reported and addressed. No passenger should have to go through what you did today. That was better. Not just words, not just an empty apology wrapped in expensive compensation, but a systemic shift. Gabrielle let the silence stretch. Considering. Then, she nodded. I want it in writing. The attendant blinked again, caught off guard. Ma'am? I want an official statement. Gabrielle clarified. Not just a promise whispered on a plane. If they're serious about change, they'll make it public. The flight attendant's eyes flickered with something, respect. Perhaps. He nodded. I'll pass that along. Gabrielle inclined her head in thanks, then returned her gaze to the window. The horizon was shifting, the sun dipping below the clouds, painting the sky in soft hues of amber and violet. It felt poetic somehow, like a new chapter unfolding in real time. For the first time since boarding, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. This victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been made to feel small. She thought of the young black woman who might board a flight next week, sitting in first class for the first time, unaware of the battle that had been fought to ensure that she was treated with the respect she deserved. She thought of the countless people who had been asked to move, to compromise, to make it easier for someone else, people who had learned, over time, that it was safer to comply than to demand fairness. She thought of herself, years ago, when she had still believed that silence was the best form of survival. But not today. Today, she had spoken. And today, the world had listened. The intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the earlier delay. We will now be preparing for departure. There was a shift in the cabin. The quiet rustling of passengers settling back into their seats. The return of normalcy after the unexpected storm. But Gabrielle knew something had changed. Not just for her. For all of them. The wheels of the plane finally touched the runway. A smooth landing after hours of turbulence, not in the skies, but within the walls of the first-class cabin. Gabrielle Lawson remained in her seat, watching as the passengers around her slowly gathered their belongings, preparing to disembark. The journey had ended, but the impact of what had transpired on this flight would ripple far beyond this single moment. Evelyn Stokes was long gone, escorted off the aircraft long before they had even left the gate. Deborah Lane and Greg, the flight crew members who had hesitated too long in choosing fairness over status, had faced swift consequences. And Gabrielle? She had not only held her ground, she had shifted it. It wasn't just about keeping her seat. It was about changing the narrative. As she stood, adjusting her blazer and slipping her notebook back into her bag, a woman from a few rows back reached out, touching her arm gently. Miss Lawson, she said, her voice quiet but full of something deep. Something real. I just wanted to say, thank you. Gabrielle turned, surprised. The woman, perhaps in her late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a warmth in her eyes, offered a small, sincere smile. I saw what you did back there. What you stood for. And I know you didn't just do it for yourself. You did it for all of us who've been made to feel like we don't belong in places we've earned. Gabrielle's chest tightened slightly. She nodded, giving the woman a reassuring squeeze on the hand. We all deserve to be treated with respect, she said. The woman exhaled, nodding in agreement. I just hope the world is finally listening. And for once, Gabrielle believed it might be. A ripple effect that reached the world. In the weeks following the incident, the airline released an official statement. They didn't just apologize. They didn't just offer generic platitudes or scripted corporate remorse. They acted. The company announced a complete overhaul of their staff training program, implementing mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion education for every employee, from the flight crew to corporate executives. They promised to introduce a new passenger advocacy system, ensuring that future complaints of discrimination would be formally reviewed, with accountability measures in place. But perhaps the biggest shift was their decision to create a Passenger Rights and Fairness Committee, inviting Gabrielle to serve as one of its founding advisors. When Marcus Caldwell, the senior executive Gabrielle had called from the plane, reached out to extend the invitation, his voice carried the weight of someone who had learned. We failed you that day, he admitted, and I can't promise that we'll never fail again. But what I can promise is that we're going to make sure we learn from it. And we'd be honored if you helped us build something better. Gabrielle could have refused, could have told them that it wasn't her job to fix a system that should have never been broken in the first place. But she also knew that real change didn't happen from the outside. It had to be built from within. And so, she accepted. A lesson for everyone. What this story teaches us about life. Gabrielle's story isn't just about an airline. It's about all of us. It's about the silent battles we face every day. The moments when we are expected to step aside. To apologize for simply existing in spaces we have every right to be in. It's about recognizing our worth and refusing to be erased. It's about speaking up, even when it's easier to stay silent. And perhaps most importantly, it's about the responsibility of those in power to listen, to learn, and to do better. There are Evelyn Stokes in every industry, in every country, in every corner of society, people who believe that their privilege gives them more of a right to something than others. But there are also Gabrielle Lawsons, people who refuse to yield, who understand that dignity is not a luxury. So, what can we take from this? 1. Know your worth and stand firm. Gabrielle didn't move because she knew she didn't have to. She had earned her place. And no amount of entitlement from someone else could take that from her. You don't have to justify your right to exist in a space you've worked for. 2. Silence is complicity. Speak up. If Gabrielle had quietly moved to another seat, the story would have ended before it began. But because she refused, she created change that reached beyond herself. Injustice thrives where voices are silent. Don't be afraid to use yours. 3. People will test your strength. Hold the line. The flight attendants, the supervisor, even Evelyn herself expected Gabrielle to cave. But she didn't. The world will always test you, but your strength is in knowing when to say no. 4. Real change requires more than apologies. The airline's response mattered not because they said sorry, but because they backed their words with policy changes. Hold people accountable. Make them do more than just apologize. 5. Respect should never be conditional. It shouldn't take money, status, or connections to be treated with basic human decency. Every person, regardless of race, background, or social standing, deserves to be treated with dignity. Your voice matters. Let's keep this conversation going. Now, it's your turn. What do you think? Was the airline's response enough? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand your ground like Gabrielle? What would you have done in her place? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Let's make sure people like Gabrielle know they're not alone. If this story inspired you, hit that like button, not just for Gabrielle, but for everyone who has ever had to fight for their place. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, subscribe to the channel for more stories that empower, challenge, and inspire. Because stories like this need to be told. Because respect is not negotiable. Because the world needs more voices like Gabrielle's and yours. And together, we can make sure those voices are heard.